The Legend of Zelda series is often acclaimed for its creativity and innovation, with many games within the series tackling new themes and concepts. Whether it be traveling through time, sailing the seas, or exploring Hyrule, the Zelda series seems to welcome change. Although, while 3D Zelda has certainly seen advancements in the form of the recent Breath of the Wild, a considerable growth can be displayed within 2D Zelda. Enter the Minish Cap. Being a handheld Zelda, the game has a fairly interesting backstory. With the success of Link's Awakening on Game Boy, Nintendo decided to follow up on its success, which would later lead to a partnership with Capcom to develop the Oracle games. Nonetheless, what really made these games stand out are its depths of immersion while being on a handheld, with Link's Awakening lightly touching on moral issues surrounding the Windfish. If awakened, the entire island, along with its residents that Link interacts with, will simply all disappear. Or in the Oracle series that spans 2 games, with Oracle of Ages focusing more on puzzles, whereas Seasons focus more on action. So all things considered, Nintendo decided to further expand on the handheld Zelda, this time continuing its partnership with Capcom. Released for the Game Boy Advance in 2004, the Minish Cap garnered much acclaim. Nonetheless, with over a decade since its release, does this game still hold up? Briefly looking at the story, the game first tells the tale of the Pokori, a tiny elvish race that gave aid to Hyrule during a time of crisis, later bestowing the kingdom a sword known as the Pokori Blade, with its evils that ran amok were sealed into a bound chest. As a result, successive generations within Hyrule would celebrate via a festival. Thus begins the main plot of the game. With the festival came a tournament for swordsmen, with one man showing extreme talent by the name of Vaati. Victorious in the tournament, Link was charged by his grandfather to present him a sword. However, during the winter ceremony, Vaati quickly betrayed the kingdom and broke the seal of the bound chest, breaking the Pokori Blade in the process. And seeing Princess Zelda as a threat, he quickly turned her into stone. Throwing Hyrule into chaos once more, Link was tasked to find the tiny Pokori and reforge the broken blade. It's at this point where Minish Cap's gameplay really does shine. During the starting portions, you encounter the hat Eslo, who has similar grievances against Vaati. Ultimately, with him, you're able to shrink down to Minish size. What's really interesting about this feature is that not only does the Minish Cap retain mechanics found in previous Zelda installments, such as dungeon items, but it introduces that formula in a unique way via Minish size. You can really take a look at Hyrule in a brand new way. What were originally enemies so weak you wouldn't even bother with, all of a sudden became bosses in their own right. The first boss is one case of this, which is encountering a normal Choo-Choo. Technically speaking, I really like how the game incorporated Minish size not only with the puzzles, but also the bosses. The fight against the boss Mazal, for one, was interesting, and the fact that you actually have to enter inside the boss via Minish form. Dungeons too are largely incorporated with this mechanic. The first dungeon, Deepwood Shrine, does well in introducing Minish form in greater detail, via entering new locations through small pathways or spinning inside a barrel for the same result. Although I wouldn't say that Minish form is the only puzzle mechanic found within this game. There is the traditional Zelda formula revolving around gaining new items and solving puzzles using said items. However, the nature of using these items is also implemented in exploring new regions of Hyrule, a method that isn't dissimilar to a Metroidvania. But first off, how is this game structured? Well, let's start with Eslo. He pretty much acts as this game's Navi. Albeit far more snarky, he does offer hints on what to do next. Plus, he is very much integrated within the game's plot in a major way. In terms of the overall gameplay, it does take a few liberties from the traditional 2D Zelda. One of my biggest critiques on the Zelda series is that many of the items found within the games are very situational, as in item usage for a particular dungeon is reserved largely in that space. A good example of this is the spinner from Twilight Princess. In the case of Minish Cap, the problem isn't as prevalent. Of course, the game brings back old staples like bombs and arrows, but there's 3 items that deserve special notice: the Gust Jar, the Cane of Pakai, and the Mole Mitts. Found in the first dungeon, you gain the Gust Jar right after the Adapillar mini-boss fight. The jar has many uses. Not only can you suck in certain enemies, but you can also use it to sail through water. In the second dungeon, the Cave of Flames, you gain the Cane of Pakai. With it, you can flip different items and propel yourself across distances. And in the third dungeon, the Fortress of Winds, the mole myths allow Link to dig through certain barriers and explore new areas. Interestingly enough, you also get the ocarina in the same dungeon, but this time it's used purely for fast travel. The rest of the items in the game are fairly standard, like the lantern, boomerang, and returning Pegasus boots. Although in the fifth dungeon, the Palace of Winds, you receive the Rocks Cape, which allows Link to glide. But what I really like about this item is that you can use it in conjunction with Link's sword, utilizing it to learn a new sword technique while using the cape as an item that can be used for many instances. In short, what I really like about the items in Minish Cap is that they're not as situational as in other Zelda games. The Gust Jar has plenty of uses that revolve around repelling enemies along with sailing. The Cane of Pakai can be used to gain access to new areas, while the Mole Myths are used for a similar purpose. Plus, the Rocks Cape can be used alongside Link's sword. Additionally, the items in Minish Cap have a very unique relationship with the overworld. Hyrule this time around isn't so much of an open field, but more like sections to be explored. Remember how I mentioned that item usage in this game was similar to a Metroidvania? Well, once you obtain more tools and items, more places begin to open up for you in a broad way. For example, obtaining the Mole Myths allow you to venture into new areas to gain loot. Plus, the game makes its own spin on side quests via the Kinstones. How they work is fairly simple. Scattered around Hyrule are halves of these Kinstones, and if you encounter other characters who possess the other half, you can gain access to new areas or gain items. While I do like this unique take on side quests, Kinstone collecting can definitely drag. Like in one instance, I managed to complete a Kinstone quest, but my only reward was yet to get another Kinstone. Plus, the only way to get light arrows in this game is via Kinstones. Light arrows make really short work on the final boss, but I was surprised that the game barely tells you that the light arrows are even a thing here. In short, light arrows are an optional item. But this also depends on what kind of gamer that you are. If you really like finding every single last item and trinket, you might really enjoy finding all the Kinstones. I usually am that type of gamer, especially with, say, Wind Waker. I need to find every last thing, but not quite as much here. With that being said, talking about the overall structure of the game, Minish Cap revolves around collecting 4 elements to repair the Picori Blade to defeat Vaati. And being a prequel to the Four Swords series, Minish Cap does introduce puzzles which allude to them. Once Link collects a couple of the elements, he's able to clone himself. Up to 4 clones can exist at one time, granted with the number of elements to match. These clones essentially control as one Link, but they do add another layer to the puzzle solving within the game. One of my favorite instances of using the clones is during the Gaiorg boss fight, in which you have to make good use of them to get through it. And since Minish Cap is a prequel to the Four Swords series, the influence between the two is fairly considerable. The first Four Swords game came bundled with Link to the Past on the Game Boy Advance, and the latter Four Swords Adventures later expanding on it. Minish Cap by itself is a prequel to the Four Swords series, and in terms of gameplay mechanics, it does pave the way to the Four Swords Adventures, which would release a year after Minish Cap's launch. In terms of dungeons for the game, there's about 7 of them, each with their own themes. Additionally, the bosses are fairly challenging, yet nostalgic. For example, the boss Gleerock is very reminiscent to the King Dodongo fight in Ocarina of Time. Even the way you enter the boss room is spot on to the Gleerock encounter. Another example can be found in the fight against Mazal, which is very similar to Godan in Wind Waker. Which reminds me, it seems that Nintendo really likes bosses which include floating hands. They're everywhere, to Ocarina of Time, Mario 64, Wind Waker, and even in the recent Super Mario Odyssey. But moving on, the dungeons in general make good use of how Link handles within this game, which leads me to the controls. Similar to the Zelda games of old, you can assign weapons and tools to the A and B buttons. The R button is assigned for certain actions at the moment, but interestingly enough, you can use the R to roll, which would make Minish Cap one of the few 2D Zeldas that allows Link to do so, the other being Four Swords Adventures, which just goes to show the amount of influence these games have with each other. Nevertheless, I do have a critique with this setup. I wish the shield was integrated with the controls more seamlessly. Here, you actually have to equip it as an item to even use it. Personally, I thought the shield in the game would act as it did in the previous 2D Zeldas, as a piece of equipment and not so much an item. For example, in Zelda 1 and Link to the Past, shields largely acted as a piece of armor protecting Link's front. However, in Minish Cap, it acts as its own item. And since the Game Boy Advance has a limited amount of buttons to be assigned with items, I found myself using most other items besides the shield, though I will say that this issue was corrected in the later Link Between Worlds. With that being said, what I really like about Minish Cap is how it advanced Zelda's combat system via sword techniques, in which Link can learn new sword moves throughout the game from different people. This feature in particular was new at the time and no doubt influenced later Zelda games. For instance, one of the sword techniques is the roll attack, which does make a return in Twilight Princess. What I really like about the sword techniques in Minish Cap is that it offers an extra dimension in side quests. Learning these techniques are completely optional, with some of them requiring certain items or have an X amount of heart containers to even learn them. But doing so really makes Link an unstoppable force. Moving on to the presentation of Minish Cap, I'm really impressed how well the game manages to flesh out a world using the Game Boy Advance's hardware. Again, seeing the world in Minish size does have its place outside of puzzle solving and bosses. You'll find yourself going through plains of grass which appear to be dense forests, or dodging things as simple as raindrops. Needless to say, the art direction is well done to this end. Plus, I really like how the Minish are integrated within this game. Inside some of the regular houses, you can encounter some Minish for side quests, along with fleshing out the lore behind them. In terms of music, a lot of it does remind me of A Link to the Past, but with its own twist. There are returning melodies to be sure, but Vati's and Eslo's themes do add their own characterization. What I especially like is the theme of Hyrule Castle's interior, which is a song from the original Zelda. I love nostalgic throwbacks like this. The final boss fight against Vati is fairly challenging, but if you have the light arrows, the fight becomes far easier. One critique I have for this fight is that if you die, you go back to the start of the dungeon and have to work your way back and rewatch the cutscene before the fight. In other dungeons, I didn't really have an issue with this. However, Vati has 3 forms you have to run across, but I did enjoy Vati as a villain. Plus, I did like how you got to learn some of his backstory. Overall, the plot and gameplay for Minish Cap is fun, albeit a short ride. It'll take you about 15 hours to get through the main story, but double that if you're a completionist. The Minish Cap may be a little bit of an overlooked Zelda game, however, what it offers is worthy of the Zelda brand. Personally, I'd love to see an HD remake of this. If you're looking to pick it up, it's available on the Game Boy Advance, plus the Wii U Virtual Console, and I wouldn't be too surprised if the game eventually made it to the Switch's Virtual Console. Regardless, the Minish Cap offers a new way to take a look at Hyrule. With engaging puzzles and a colorful cast of characters, this game is a treat to any Zelda fan, which makes me a bit curious for what happens in the future. Rumors persist whether or not Nintendo will continue to develop 2D Zeldas. Nonetheless, the foundations of the Legend of Zelda series will remain in the games of old.